Doesn't it like distort my face too?
Oh, absolutely.
Make it look like.
You get like stretched.
Okay, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to our last class of sustainable business for 497 and 495. Welcome to our folks online. We are honored today to have Jay Bauer, who is the manager of Puget Sound Energy's Environmental and Social Responsibility Group. Is that the correct title?
Sustainability.
Sustainability.
Easier to say.
Yeah, but we are really lucky today because Jay actually has some interesting experience dating back a long time. I'll let him date himself, but working with Landau and then running Landau, which is a very respected consulting organization here in the region. And also, as he shared with us, started his career working utilities and has come full circle now with Puget Sound Energy. So Jay, welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this will really date me. Anybody ever heard of Aaron Brockovich? Seen the movie? I was out on site sampling water wells on the day of discovery for the whole Aaron Brockovich. I was working for Pacific Gas Electric Company, so 85 or 6, somewhere in there. Anyway, a long time ago.
I brought my parents to Dubon.
What was that?
You're not muted online, I think. Please mute if you're online.
I don't know if it's gonna advance, maybe page down.
So the question is, it tabbed over to it.
Boy, I don't know. High tech. Let me try this.
Let's try it again.
There we go.
Oh, okay.
So in sustainability, they talk a lot about materiality. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but it's kind of like what's important to your organization. And what's material to Puget Sound Energy is carbon, and carbon, like real estate with location. The other things are really important too. The social part of it, where we're really, concerned with diversity, equity, inclusion. And the social and the governance piece of it is really important to make sure the board has buy-in and is enforcing what's going on with sustainability in the organization. But really comes down to being able to make electricity in a sustainable manner, because otherwise we're not getting the job done. So these are the 4 areas I was going to hit. How much carbon are we emitting? I guess we being me, Puget Sound Energy. What are the drivers for reducing carbon emissions? How can we reduce those emissions? And what's our game plan? And then what are the challenges to that? What's going to get in the way as we try to do this clean energy transition? That's got a little block on there. This says 100. So greenhouse gas emissions in Washington State are about 100 million metric tons a year. That was in 2019. And out of that, electricity generation is about 22 million. So, over 20% of the emissions in the state are just out of power generation. Puget Sound Energies are about 9 million metric tons. And that's both with what we generate and what we purchase, because we only generate about half of the electricity that we put out on the grid. The other half we're buying either at market or from what they call firm contracts, long-term contracts. So that's about 9 million metric tons. And I'm going to talk mostly about electricity, but we're also a gas utility. And part of our greenhouse gas emissions, if you've heard of, and I'll get to it in a minute, but scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are those that are associated. They're indirect emissions. They're either upstream or downstream of you. And when we sell natural gas, people generally burn it. And so that creates CO2. And so we count that as part of our emissions too. So if you add those together, you got 9 and 6, you're up to 15% of the total in the state. So it really puts us in a great position to actually do something. We're not nibbling at the edges. We actually are 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And then the other plan we have is to help with electrifying transportation. And transportation, you can see, probably can't see in the little graph here, is almost 40% in the state. So cars running up and down. And we will help put in the infrastructure. We aren't buying people electric cars or anything, but get the infrastructure out there so they're charging stations. Basics of greenhouse gas accounting. I don't know if have you kind of gone through this at all? Maybe.
Never hurts to repeat.
Scope 1 emissions, those that you, those are directly related to your operations. And so for us, that's mostly power plants. And we burn, in the state, we burn natural gas and a little bit of diesel. They call it number 2 fuel, diesel, it's the same thing. And, but it's almost entirely natural gas. We also buy power from Centralia Power Plant, TransAlta, that's a coal plant. And we own a piece of coal strip, which is in Montana. And that's a coal plant, it's a coal strip would imply. But the TransAlta stuff is going to be scope 3, right? So if you can, it took me forever to get scope 1, 2, and 3 down. So, but hang on to it. But scope 1 is basically what we're generating. Scope 2 is tiny for us. It's the power that we buy to run our facilities that are outside our service area. Because the power that we generate in our service area, we just serve ourselves. And so it's like we have a mint farm power plant down in near Kelso, and we've got a Goldendale power plant out in Goldendale. Those are outside our service area. So anything we use, any electricity that we use to light the office buildings, or when there's a power outage and we need to buy power, that's scope 2. And it's a really tiny number. Scope 3 is all that power that we buy. You know, everything from we buy power under contract from a lot of dams on the Columbia River, so that's a lot of green power. We buy that TransAlta power that I mentioned, that's coal, and we buy a lot of power at market, they say. So there's just this trading market that's going on every day, and if you don't have enough to meet the next day's load, then you go out and you buy. You should do a short-term contract and buy that power. So that's all scope 3. And then scope 3 is also all those natural gas emissions. So by scope, these are the magnitude. We talked about it being, you know, like 15 million metric tons altogether. There's about 9 for gas or for scope 3, and then scope 1, which is what we're generating, is down there about 5 or 6. And then if you look at our emissions over time for electric and gas, see a big drop here in 2020. So question is why? We see it here too. This top line is demand, what we call load, to serve load. That's the amount of electricity we need to put on the grid to serve our customers. That top line just kind of keeps going up. There's a little dip right there. That's what, thank you, COVID, is the reason for the dip there. But there's a much larger dip and a little bit of recovery after that in our emissions, which is this other line along this second y-axis. And the secret is here. If you look at this plot down below, you've got coal on the top line. Coal takes a big drop off. And you can see it's very difficult to see. There's a light blue line that's natural gas. It stays pretty constant. And then market purchases goes, or natural gas, I guess is the darker one, goes up a little bit in the end, and then market purchases stays pretty static. What happened there is 2 units at coal strip shut down, units 1 and 2. We made up the difference in gas with gas and market purchases, but coal emits an awful lot of carbon dioxide for every pound of coal that you burn. So, or particularly every megawatt of energy that you generate. So that's why we saw that drop, and also unit 1 at Centralia. So there were 2 units at Centralia, one of them shut down in the same time frame as 2 out of 4 of them shut down in coal strip. So you can see a big impact of that. So what do we do to get people to use less coal? They tried that in the Obama administration. They got flushed on that one. They tried to say that we're going to get rid of coal, and they told the EPA they couldn't do that. So in Washington, we have, and I'll get to it in a minute, but we have the Climate Commitment Act, which effectively puts a price on coal. You get a certain number of allowances for the emissions that you generate to make electricity. If you go over that, you got to buy allowances. But it is putting a price on coal. And so the theoretical example here is, I'm sorry for the underlying, but this over here, this coal only costs like 20-25 bucks a megawatt hour to generate. If you didn't put a price of coal on top of it, it's really cheap to generate with coal. But there's about a little over a ton of carbon dioxide associated with each megawatt hour to generate power with coal. If you generate it with a combined cycle, I'm sorry, I'm switching terminology because I'm in the utility business. Combined cycle power plant is natural gas, mostly is when it's burning. Actually, entirely is when it's burning. But you only get about a half ton of carbon dioxide for every megawatt hour. And you need a certain number of megawatt hours to serve the load. So however you can make that up, if you can do it with combined cycle natural gas, you're going to emit like half of what you would if you do that with coal. So what happens here is if you start putting a price on carbon, you tell people, hey, you're going to have to pay 20 bucks for every ton of carbon dioxide you emit. Then the total price of this is 20 bucks that it costs to dispatch it, plus you got to pay 20 bucks for that ton. So you're up to 40 something on a little over 40 because of the 1.1. But it's raising, actually it's down here. Yeah, coal's down here. And natural gas is more expensive because it's more expensive to dispatch natural gas. The plants are more expensive. The cost of natural gas is a bit higher than coal. But if you keep raising the price of carbon, what it costs to emit a ton of carbon dioxide, and this is all just theoretical numbers, but here, at this point where you start charging people 35 bucks a ton, you reach a point where it crosses over, and then all of a sudden it's more expensive to burn coal. So that's kind of the whole concept behind trying to put a price on carbon, which they talk a lot about, but they've never done it at a national level. So we finally did it at a state level. It'd be great if we could do it at a national level, in my opinion. But so the trend throughout the region, this dark area down here is coal. So you can see that coal's really dropped off. Coal's about 20% of the power in the country now. It used to be the majority of the power generated in the country.
How long ago?
You know,
Was it about 50%?
I'd have to look back. It's certainly not, well, actually, right about 2000, it looks like it's close to right about 50% there. So I would have thought it was even further back than that, but I think 90%, it was just hearing that West Virginia is over 90%. I'm not sure why their legislators are so interested in keeping coal going, but Sykes family owns the coal mines. But you can see that natural gas basically made up for it because natural gas keeps getting wider here, and that's kind of stayed the same as far as the contribution of both of them. Nuclear has stayed about the same. Haven't built any new plants yet lately. Wind kept getting bigger. Starts out a little tiny slice, ends up getting pretty sizable down at the sun. Geothermal's tiny. Biomass is tiny. Utility scale solar started picking up 2013, 2011, 2013. Makes a decent hit now. And then hydroelectric and pump storage has been pretty constant as well. You know what pump storage is? Familiar with that? You take, excess power when you don't need it to serve the grid, and you pump water uphill between two reservoirs. And then when you need the power, you let it run back downhill. And it sounds great, but it is great. It's like a giant battery. So very useful for renewable resources, right? Because the wind doesn't blow all the time, sun doesn't shine all the time. Pump the water uphill when you can, let it run back down. I guess the only issue with them is they're not super efficient. I mean, you lose a bunch, right? Because there's frictional losses and everything when you're pumping the water uphill, and I think I want to say they're like 40% efficient. They're not super efficient, but anyway, that's the only downside of them. They're usually off basin. They're not usually, these days anyway, if they construct them, they aren't damming rivers or anything with them. They're putting them between a couple of reservoirs. In fact, there's one that they're talking about building down near Goldendale now. Where the one reservoir would be down at the Columbia River level and the other one would be up around the plateau. So we'll see. There's another one in Montana that we had an interest in or interested in looking at, but it's not as far along in water rights permitting as we were hoping. But they can be quite large. The one in Montana was going to be 400 megawatts, which is about the size of a large combined cycle thermal plant in Washington. Our facility in Goldendale, I think, is about 300 megawatts, and the Mint Farm one is about the same. So it's about, and it'll run for like 8 hours of power at 400 megawatts. So it's a big battery. So what's driving greenhouse gas emissions reduction? Well, in Washington, we have a lot of laws that are driving it. Got the Washington Clean Energy Transformation Act. Have you talked about that at all? A little bit. 2019, that passed. Says no coal after 2025. So guess what? We're going to have no coal after 2025, which is good. TransAlta is going to shut down at the end of 2025, and we are transferring ownership, our share. We own 25% right now of units 3 and 4 at Colstrip, transferring that to the operator, who's Talent Energy. And I don't know what they plan on continuing to run it, but it won't. That power won't be coming into Washington anymore. We have to be greenhouse gas neutral by 2030, and what that means is we have to be 80% clean energy, so hydro, wind, solar, and then we can make up the other 20% with what they call offsets, which is forest projects or what have you to offset those other emissions. 2045 has to be 100% clean. So it is interesting. I wonder if they're going to do anything different in the law, but right now that's 100% clean for what we deliver to people's meters. And you take like some electrical class, you'll find out that there's resistance in wires and those are heat losses. And it turns out it's pretty significant. It's like 5% of the electricity that we put out on the grid goes into heat. So right now that 5% could technically still be fossil fuel, the way the law is written. Who knows? I won't be watching that closely in 2045.
Jay, I think that's
Yeah.
language, we've looked a lot at sustainability strategies and approaches. If the Washington State Clean Energy Transformation Act uses the word 100% clean, why does Puget Sound Energy use net zero?
It's net zero. The net zero is the same thing as the greenhouse gas neutral. So that's the 2030 objective.
But the Puget Sound Energy has a net zero plan for 2025, right?
Oh, the beyond net zero,
Net zero.
the way it's called beyond net zero.
What the distinction in Puget Sound Energy line between net zero and clean?
I think the electricity is going to be clean. I think there's a big quandary about what to do about natural gas.
So it recognizes the stranded assets and gas.
Well, it's not just stranded assets. It's right now there's nothing in place that makes people switch.
Yeah.
And we have to keep serving customers as long as there's natural gas customers the way it is now. Until they were to change that. And actually right now, there's nothing that, as far as I know, there's no incentive to get people, aside from the economics, ultimately, there's no incentive to get people off of gas furnaces at home and onto a heat pump. There's no, like there's rebates on a lot of these programs, and there's nothing right now about what they call that fuel switching when you go from gas to electric. So will there be something down the road? I don't know, some sort of incentive. I think that's what it might take or it just keeps getting warmer every summer because heat pumps cool in the summer too. So you got that benefit as well. But for right now, we're working on renewable natural gas. We've tried some hydrogen blending. We've tried blending up to like 15% hydrogen in a couple of pilot tests. So that's a possibility as far as making it a lower carbon fuel. But we could have a whole discussion too on where do you get the hydrogen and what did you do to get the hydrogen and how clean is the hydrogen? So, or the process that got you there.
Okay, sorry, we had one question online.
Yeah.
it seems pertinent to what you were just discussing. You mentioned the no coal standard 2025. This person asks, are there any legal or administrative challenges for moving away from the use of coal any earlier?
I would, boy, I'm really talking above my pay grade right now, but because a lot of it happened before I got to Puget Sound Energy, but I'll use the TransAlta contract as an example. We have a power purchase agreement with them, what they call, that's what you have, it's a long-term contract with any power producer. And as I understand it, this thing was specially negotiated with the state of Washington to allow enough funding for TransAlta to basically get out of there. So we actually are signed up to buy a certain amount of power from TransAlta right through December 31st of 2025. Little nuance on that contract is that they actually don't have to deliver us coal power. They just have to deliver us 380 megawatts. And they choose at times to buy power at market and give it to us to satisfy their obligation. So it's not 100% coal that we get from them. It's been getting higher the last few years. So I don't know if they're, I'm sure it's all economics. It's all driven by the economics of the situation, but a great question. As far as coal strip, hard deal to even get that, that agreement in place where we transition ownership over to Talon. And I don't know what all blood, sweat, and tears went into that either, but we're feeling really good about the 2025. So, anything else? Other questions come up from that? So the Climate Commitment Act is going to increase the cost of using fossil fuel. This is where gas comes in. So we had to establish a baseline, and so because we get free allowances to cover the power that we generate from our fossil units and the power we have to purchase, as long as it's agreed to by the Utilities Commission and in line with our clean energy implementation plan, which I won't get into, but that's the 4-year segment of how are we going to get to 2045. We got like a little 4-year game plan, and Utility Commission approves that. And as long as we stay in line with that, they give us enough allowances to cover the emissions. One allowance is a ton of carbon. So natural gas was a different story. We did a baseline from 2015 to 2019, look at what the average was over that time period, gave that information to, I think it's Department of Ecology does this, I wasn't directly involved. Back and forth a lot about are your numbers right over a 6-month period. Anyway, right off the bat, this year, we have 7% less than that. So they take the baseline and they go, okay, first year, 93% of that, that's what you get in allowances. The next year, 7% less, the next year, 7% less. So you can see it's going downhill fast. And after that, you got to pay for those allowances. So that payment, that cost of that's going to end up going on people's rates, and gas is going to get really expensive. That's going to be another driver to get people onto heat pumps, I suppose. But that's the intent, because CETA, which is the Clean Energy Transition Act, was meant to getting clean electricity. Climate Commitment Act is going to take the other side of that and deal with the gas side as well as electric, but that's where our gas gets taken care of. This Clean Energy Transition Act doesn't deal with natural gas at all. So we had an earlier law, the Washington State greenhouse gas emission limits. I don't remember what year that was, but we were bouncing around here. Pretty stable. I mean, up and downs. Highest in 1999. This is for the state. So 111.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. We just said that we're at about 100 now, so it's come down from that sum. But this is where we have to go to get, and it's a pretty steep cliff. But you know, so if we're here at around 100 and we have to get down here to about 50, that's really like a 50% drop from 1990 level, or from recent levels. It's 45% from 1990, but from recent levels, it's about a 50% drop by 2030. 2030 might seem like a long time to you. Right around the corner, it's 7 years away. So we're going to be in a big hurry to add more renewables. not going to really talk about Washington State Clean Fuel Standard, but that has to do with mostly with vehicles and the transportation business is going to have to go down in emissions. That's the long and short of that. It's the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. So they'll put biofuels in and other renewable aspects in order to be able to meet that objective. We got the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's a bunch of funding, whole ton of funding that's going into hydrogen development, wind farms, all sorts of stuff. This is an interesting one. If you probably haven't heard about it, but there's proposed SEC rules on climate-related disclosures. Those have been proposed for, I don't know, like a year now. Everybody's arguing about them, but in the end, they'll probably, I think they expect it to happen this quarter. I guess we'll see, but they'll finalize those rules, and those rules are going to require publicly traded companies and companies that hold public debt. Anybody who files a 10K, if you've ever heard that, when they file their 10K with the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, they're going to have to disclose scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and anything climate related that may impair their business. So it's going to be a big opportunity to learn what's going on with companies. A lot of those companies are disclosing that information already, but that's brand new. I really like it in concept because every time we change administration, all the rules change. And this is a bunch of people with money that don't really care who's in the administration. So these kind of things stick. And it's basically investors that are saying, hey, we think our investments might be at risk because we don't know how exposed these companies are to climate change risks. So short side trip on that one. We did what they call a TCFD analysis for Puget Sound Energy. It's a task force for climate related financial disclosures. It's a framework. You basically look at if the climate were to change this much, how do we fare? What stops working in our system? And it was really nice to find out for me that wind turbines operate just fine up to about 120 degrees. We're not expecting it to get that hot. A lot of those things checked out pretty nicely. I think the thing we're worried about is the intensity and frequency of storms in the winter that cause outages and the increasing risk of wildfire, which is not good for transmission lines. But aside from that, I thought things looked pretty good. And then you're supposed to look at what they call transitional and physical risks. And transitional risks are those that occur when people change the rules. That's the transition. And they already changed the rules for us. We have CETA and we have CCA, Climate Commitment Act. And so we're pretty set in that regard too. So pretty good outcome, I thought, from that. And then just last week, EPA came out with new greenhouse gas rules for coal and natural gas. It's really not going to affect us that much. The current rule, coal doesn't get hit till none of this hits anybody till 2030. So there's kind of a long lead time before any of this really starts impacting, and you have to have reduced emissions. So we'll be out of the coal game by then. It doesn't currently affect any power plants that are under 300 megawatts, which cuts out all of ours except 2. And we will meet the emission standards with those 2 plants till at least 2032, I think it is. And then after that, if you operate at less than 50% capacity, less than half the time, and it's enforceable, so you'd have to have a permit from the state that said you can only operate 49% of the time or whatever, then we wouldn't be covered by this either. So until they come up with some follow-up legislation that it impacts other power plants, this particular federal rule doesn't affect us, but of course we have CETA, which tells us we need 80% renewable by 2030. So how can we reduce emissions? You've heard me beating on coal. Remove coal from the portfolio. Invest in renewable energy. We're doing that. Wind, solar, storage. I think our first wind farm was in 2005, so we were kind of early to the game. We have I think we have 773 megawatts. I'm going to keep throwing megawatt numbers out. In wind energy and 3 wind farms, and we have another 900 megawatts capacity with long-term contracts. So we can develop distributed energy resources. What are those? Those are solar panels on people's roofs and Tesla batteries hanging in their garage and all those sort of things. They're going to make a big difference because there's going to be more and more of it. Increased demand side management. That's also on your side of the meter. That's, hey, could you not use your power from 4 to 7 in the afternoon? And we now have new meters so we can tell when you're using your power. Can you knock it off during that time period and we'll give you a break? We'll let you charge your Tesla after 11 p.m. for a better rate, that sort of thing. So that's gonna, if you can shave the peak off of the peak demand is what causes you to need to have all these resources. So if you can shave the peak down at all, the number of megawatts of capacity you have to have by doing these things, then you don't have to generate as much. So you're that much closer to your goal. Like they say, the cheapest megawatt generated is the one that you don't have to. So develop hydrogen, renewable natural gas, and other low carbon fuels. Renewable natural gas is like from digesters at dairy farms and landfills and that sort of thing. You clean up that methane that comes off of the landfill, get the sulfur and all that stuff out of it, and that's renewable natural gas. Low carbon fuels. That could just be a hydrogen methane blend, would be a lower carbon fuel as an example. And then develop carbon capture with reuse or sequestration. I'm going to decide how far to go into each of these topics. This is a big one. So EPA's rules, people who are affected by this rule, by the time they get into the late 2030s, they got two choices. They're going to be burning a lot of hydrogen, or they're going to be doing carbon capture if they want to run either coal or natural gas. Carbon capture is just it's a methodology of grabbing carbon dioxide out of the exhaust stream from the power plant. They run it through a solution, an amine solution. I don't really understand the chemistry, but it binds up the carbon dioxide, takes it out. Then you can compress it, put it in a pipe, send it wherever you want it. Problem is, where do you want it? Sequestration is where you want it, or in a useful product. Another short to the side, but if you could generate hydrogen in a very green way, and you had excess hydrogen, and you combine it with CO2, you can make synthetic methane. You can make CH4. It's no longer a fossil fuel. You just close the loop on it, so you didn't generate any extra CO2, so you can keep doing that. But it takes energy to do all those things. The cool study, if you want to look it up, and I may have put a link at the end of this presentation, but there's a cool study that PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab, did in the basalt out in eastern Washington, down by Washougal, down by the Columbia River. And they drilled some really deep holes, and they pumped carbon dioxide down there. And the whole thing was to see if carbon dioxide will mineralize in basalt. Lo and behold, it does. It works great, at least in their test case. And so there's a lot of hope that that's actually going to be a great sequestration methodology. And it kind of turns into a limestone. You could see they have a core. You can kind of see the white speckles all over it. So, and the definition of sequestration in Washington is pretty rigid. It's 99% retention for 1,000 years. So it has to really be good in order to count. But by the way, that's the way you can keep running a fossil fuel plant, right? So you can even burn natural gas this way as long as you capture, most of the carbon dioxide. So why do you need natural gas plants? One reason is for reliability. People expect to be able to turn the light on, and it's weird. And what's really rotten is a lot of times when it's really hot or really cold in Washington, the wind isn't blowing. It's like dead still. And those wind turbines are just kind of laughing. And then a lot of times it's cloudy. So we do have solar resources in eastern Washington, but they aren't working so hot. And we need a way to generate power during that. So until we get to a point where there's better stuff to fill in with, natural gas is it right now, because you can flip a switch, especially with what they call a peaker plant, single cycle. Too much detail, but it starts up in a matter of minutes. You literally just flip the switch and it's going. And that's what we need right now to make up that difference. Down the road, could be small modular nuclear that's making up for that. It could be pump storage if we have more pump storage, because that's immediate. You can just let the water run through the turbines, you got power. I could think of other things, I'm sure, but transmission, big problem. We have enough transmission to get power to, we don't have any more wind or solar resources really in Western Washington. It's just not great. It's cloudy a lot of the time. And there's just not that much area to develop wind, and the wind doesn't blow as hard or as frequently as we need it to actually be efficient. And that is in Wyoming and Montana. And so you got to get the power from there to here. And we have about enough transmission to get us up through 2030. And after that, they're kind of looking at it going, okay, that's a new transmission line or a total reconfiguration of what they have. And it really is a big issue that they're looking at. So one of the reasons it's really hard is permitting in public opposition. Nobody likes new power lines. Technology development's a real challenge. Carbon capture, sequestration, hydrogen, those first three are actually in EPA's proposal right now. They're being called proven technologies as far as, you know, shifting over for power plants, for coal and natural gas power plants. There's a lot of people that would argue that it's not necessarily proven. And, you know, sequestration, like we just talked about, what happens if you don't have a whole bunch of basalt? It's going to be a little bit problematic. And we don't have the capacity to flip everything over to hydrogen. I saw a paper the other day that said that if Florida moved their coal plants onto hydrogen, or no, I guess all their combined cycle plants, but anyway, some natural gas plants over to hydrogen, it would take 3.9, I think it was million metric tons of hydrogen a year. The US production is 10. So one state's going to take 40% of what we make right now. So we're going to have to figure out how to make a whole lot more hydrogen if that piece is going to work for flipping over plants. Everything's hard to build. Equity is a brand new part of CETA. It's a really important part of the Clean Energy Transition Act. It basically says everybody needs to enjoy the benefits of moving to clean energy transition. You can't put the same burden on everybody. If people are low income, you can't charge them huge rates to help pay for all this infrastructure. So it definitely has equity in mind. We're supposed to maintain affordability. That's part of our mandate. This is going to become a very relative term, I think. You know, do it as cheap as we can, but it's going to cost everybody more money to make this clean energy transition. Those are just some links if you want to look around. I think this is probably my last slide. And I'm going a little bit too far here, but I can't help myself. So I got all capacity megawatts is not equal. This is another issue with wind, and I mentioned that it doesn't blow all the time. If you have a natural gas combined cycle power plant, it can run 80% of the time, no problem. Has a couple of, you know, port outages during the year, do a little maintenance on it. It can run 80% of the time. So if you take a natural gas plant and you say, we want to run it 80% of the time, you can. And so you take the megawatts that you have, you multiply it times 60 hours per year, and you get how many megawatt hours of electricity you can generate. And with coal, recently, you know, that the coal plant in Montana, this last year, it ran at 84%. This is out of our 10K. So it's kind of fun to go look at these things, honestly, because they're very, I mean, the numbers are all out there if you want to go look at it. But this is, you know, 370 megawatts is the capacity that we own out at Colstrip. We own 25% of it. So if you do the math, you can figure out how big the whole plant is. 2.7 million megawatt hours is what we got out of that plant last year. So if you multiply the 370 times 8760, divide that into 2.7 million, you get that it was running 84% of the time. So if you look at our wind and solar resources, we've got 773 megawatts capacity, they call that nameplate capacity. That's like while it's running full blast, that's what it generates. But if you look at the number of megawatt hours we got out of it, you can see that on average, it was running 25% of the time. That's not bad for Eastern Washington. That's about what you get. So if you're trying to replace 200 megawatts of natural gas or coal with the equivalent amount of actual energy delivered for wind, you probably need like 3 times as much nameplate capacity in wind in order to be able to do that. Nice thing about Wyoming and Montana is they're up in the like 35+% range, which makes a big difference compared to this 25%. Got time for questions. I think that's it. Yeah.
I have a question. It looks like a lot of the stuff pushing like sustainability action at PSC is related to like legislation. Is there any other factors that would push you guys to take sustainability action like before it's legally required?
Well, I mean, I suppose there are some things that we do, but basically we can't do anything that the Utilities Commission doesn't approve. I'll give you an example. We would love to do some R&D. We'd like to have, we'd like to have a big, I should say we like to have, because I have to talk to my hydrogen guy, but we'd like to have, I would think we'd like to do more research on actually generating hydrogen and being able to, do the cycle on that. We can't get funding for anything called R&D. They just don't like the term R&D, I guess. Part of that is we're just they call us fully regulated utility because we're a monopoly. Nobody can buy power. They have to buy it from us. If you move into a neighborhood and it's PSC, kind of stuck with us. So the other side of that is we have a utilities commission that absolutely regulates every dollar that gets spent. So I would like to say yes, but we do some nice birthday things and stuff. Nice community days. Good question, though. I would love to be able to say yes, and you know why? Because I'm responsible for providing our environmental, social, and governance report. And I would love to be able to have a little sidebar thing there that says, you know what we did last year? We did this, and aren't we great? But you can report on what you're able to do. I can say we have a lot of really smart people there that are trying to make what we have to do happen, which is not insignificant. So.
I have a question about equity and like indigenous communities. So I just was wondering if you could talk more about what you do, especially, Washington is a very hydro heavy state and that has disproportionate impacts on indigenous communities. Yeah, if you could talk a little bit more.
To the extent that I know anything about it, I mean, I believe that the tribes are very happy with us as far as the Baker project goes, which is our largest hydroelectric facility. There's a giant fish hatchery there, and basically that salmon run almost completely petered out. And within a couple of years of all the work that was done, I think they had 1 million fish or something. You can look up on the Northwest Hydrologic Association or I could send a link, but there's a big story on it that we didn't do. But there was a lot of negotiation that went into that. And I don't remember how many millions got spent there, but it's kind of, the dam was built in, I don't know what it was, 1904 or something. It's like, it's been there forever. But they have a big fish hatchery there now, and then they have a fish taxi where they scoop the fish up and they move them upstream. And then they've got a giant fish collector that kind of sucks them in and moves them back down to the hatchery. And so they kind of big workaround for that. But honestly, I can only speak to that part of the hydropower. So I realize it can be a contentious issue for sure, but I'm just not directly involved in it. The fish hatchery is nice for me to write about in ESG report. Any more hard questions? Come on, hard.
If you had a magic wand, you've seen this industry now for a while. What are we talking about that excites you that we should be talking about in terms of opportunities to get after? Sounds like we're done disagreeing or fighting about whether or not we should be taking these steps. but what's getting in our way right now?
Well, I do think it would be nice to, have a little bit more freedom with funding, but, that's my view to the bottom. So I'm way down. So there's like general counsel, chief sustainability officers up here. That's who's supposed to be talking to you today, but she's on a plane to DC. And then because I've known her for over 30 years, I report directly to her, but I'm at least 2 thumbs down. So you're kind of speaking to the middle management here. But I actually find things like SEC rules that are going to make people disclose what's going on. I think that this PETA thing is huge. I mean, I'm very excited about that. I mean, I realize that's not above and beyond.
Yeah.
But everything we can do towards getting that much renewable energy online. I'd like to see some permitting reform where everybody kind of, in my perfect world, everybody would get on board and realize we need more transmission and would start talking about how we're going to do it instead of, that's scary to me, 7 years away, and all of a sudden we can't get all the power we need from Wyoming and Montana over here because nothing gets permitted and built in 7 years. I mean, it just isn't, that isn't going to happen. There's going to have to be some workarounds. Hopefully the feds will come in and, tends to happen in the end. Things get bad enough. They'll come in, they'll say this is a corridor that we're, the new transmission is going to be built in and, who knows. I guess, Army Corps did that decades and decades ago, but, I think the advances are amazing. There's one of our people is heading up hydrogen, and one of the things they're looking at is taking methane and stripping the hydrogen off of the methane and you just have solid carbon coming. It's already a proven process, but we have a outfit in Seattle that wants to start commercializing it. So you can just take that fossil methane, which is either going to be methane or carbon dioxide someday, right? It's got 2 choices. Or now it can be hydrogen. They have to catalyze the reaction, but you end up with pure hydrogen and black carbon powder. They're trying to figure out what to do with the carbon powder. Could be mixed in with asphalt, maybe that sort of thing. But, so I think when you put a challenge in front of a lot of really bright people, a lot of stuff comes out. So that's what gives me hope in the whole thing. What kind of drags me down is thinking about trying to get transmission through and stuff like that, and being able to do it in an economically effective way so that everybody doesn't end up with just ridiculous power noise and stuff. So CETA does have a cost limit. They don't talk about that very much, but if they spend more than 2% of electric billing rates or something like that in a year, then they don't have to spend anymore. So there is a cap. There's an absolute nothing after 2045. I talked about allowances briefly. Allowances for gas, allowances for electricity. They're all the same. Each allowance is a permission to emit a ton of carbon. After 2045, the way the law is written now, there's no allowances. So that's it. End of the road.
Sean, do we have anybody online?
No questions right now.
I have a kind of a clarifying question. You explained earlier that you guys use the excess energy from the grid to pump the water back uphill and then let it run down, which is only 40% efficient.
That's my recollection. It's been a long time since I looked at it, but
so are there any plans of making that more efficient? Because if you're losing 60% of that energy, does that add up to a significant amount at the end of the year?
it can be, but what your hope is that you're using energy that isn't necessarily, it's in the end, what's great is to have a wind farm close to it, right? And the wind farm's generating more energy than you need on the grid right now because it's in the fall and the weather's nice, and nobody's running the air conditioner, the heater. You can use that excess electricity to pump it uphill, then it doesn't matter that much. But you're trying to change electrical energy into energy of movement, and I think it's kinetic energy. And there's just losses involved. There's heat losses, friction losses, and so I don't know that that's going to get all that much more efficient. The other thing that's really inefficient is burning natural gas in a power plant. I can see it's time to go. natural gas in a power plant. So you burn natural gas, it's got a certain amount of chemical energy in it, you make electrical energy out of it, that's, if you're lucky, that's 40% efficient. When you send that electricity to somebody's house, they put it in a resistance heater and turn it into heat, the lowest form of energy. And if they would have just taken the natural gas to the house and burned the natural gas, they get 100% of the chemical energy into heat right there. I'm not advocating for burning natural gas at people's houses. I'm saying there's a transitional rate, and until you have a renewable to supplant that, you know, things kind of have to come in order. So another challenge, I guess.
So we come to time. Thank
All right.
you very much.
Yeah.
Please join me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.